In this video, I'm going to show you how to use one of these manual film cameras. If you have no experience whatsoever and just picked one up for the first time, this video will get you ready to go out and shoot your first roll of film. Okay, so here we have the Pentax KM, but what I'm going to teach you will apply to pretty much any camera that looks vaguely like this. This style of camera is called an SLR. It stands for single lens reflex camera. Single lens is pretty self-explanatory because you know it has one lens on there, and it's called a reflex camera because it has a little mirror in here that flips up when we take a shot. Now that mirror allows us to see through the lens through this thing called the viewfinder. So you can kind of see my hand. And if you're lucky, your viewfinder will have a Lightmeter that will look something like this. It will have an indicator to show you if your photo is correctly exposed, overexposed, or underexposed. If it's directly in the center, it's correctly exposed and you're good to go. You can take a shot. But if it's slightly off center, there's several things we can do to make sure your photo is lit correctly. There's 3 things that can affect how the camera captures the light. These things are commonly referred to as the exposure triangle. Now, the first part of the exposure triangle we're going to cover is called ISO. This refers to the sensitivity of different film stocks. Now, here we have 2 different film stocks. One is slightly less sensitive to light, one is slightly more sensitive to light, and that is denoted by this number right here, the ISO or the ASA. This one has an ISO of 100, this one has an ISO of 400. Now, the ISO refers to the density of the crystals on the film, which influences how sensitive it is to light and also other things like the grain and the detail you can capture. Again, films with a lower ISO are less sensitive to light, so these are more meant to be shot in a studio setting where you have more control over the light, or outside on sunny days, or in situations where there's going to be a lot of light for you to shoot. Higher ISO film is better suited for conditions with lower light or situations where you want to shoot things that are moving faster, which brings us to the next point of the exposure triangle, and that is shutter speeds. The shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open when you hit the button. And you can change that shutter speed by turning this dial, usually located on top of the camera. These numbers right here range from bulb mode, the B, where the shutter will stay open for as long as you hold the button down. Then going up to 1 second, half a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/15 of a second, ranging all the way up to usually 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second. This will be 1/250th. Now there's a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to shutter speeds. When you're shooting handheld, you generally want to stay above 1/30th of a second to avoid your shot coming out blurry or out of focus, unless that's what you're looking for, of course. And if you want to freeze things that are in motion, you generally want to stay above 1/125th of a second. Now, obviously, these are just guidelines and not hard and fast rules. Photography is an art form, and you should just experiment and find what you enjoy. Now, the last point on the exposure triangle is called the aperture, and you'll find this inside of your lens, on this back ring of your lens right here, in numbers ranging from 2.8 or 1.8, usually up to 16 or 22. Now, these numbers denote a ratio. Just quickly grabbing another lens because it's easier to show you on this one. Now, inside a camera lens, there's these blades you can see. They open up and close down when you twist this ring. And your aperture is responsible for 2 different things in your photo. First of all, it's how much light you're letting in. So like a bigger hole means more light, a smaller hole means less light. And because these numbers are a ratio, the lower numbers will mean a bigger hole and the bigger numbers will mean a smaller hole. This can be a little bit counterintuitive, but you'll get the hang of it soon, I am sure. So the aperture is responsible for how much light you let in, but also for how much of your picture is going to be in focus. This is a concept called depth of field, and I'll try to explain it in the following way. Assume you set your camera up on a tripod somewhere and you're trying to shoot your subject at a certain distance away. Now we'll focus in on the subject and we'll call this the focal point. And what you set your aperture to will determine how much in front and behind your focal point is going to be in focus. Now the lens on this camera actually demonstrates that fairly well. As you can see here, this is the focus ring, and this red line over here denotes where on the distance you're going to be in focus. But you can see these other lines on the side of it, and these correspond to how much is going to be in focus at certain apertures. So if we set our aperture to 22 and say we focus to 1 meter away, we can see that everything up to about 3 meters is going to be in focus. Now, if we set our focus to infinity, then pretty much the whole picture will be in focus. But if you open up your aperture and shoot what is commonly known as wide open. So this will be as wide as your aperture will go. On this one, it's 2.8. You could, for example, focus on your subject's eyes, but then the top of their head or their chin may be out of focus. This is what we call a shallow depth of field. If you want to stop down to something like f5.6 or f8, you can get your whole subject in focus, but still get this kind of artistic, blurry background effect. Okay, now that we understand the exposure triangle, we can pull these levers in different directions to get the result that we like. Now, ISO is usually pretty locked in, because when you load the film, you're stuck with the same one for the entire roll. But you can play around with shutter speeds and apertures to your desire. One thing to keep in mind is that one stop on the shutter speed wheel generally corresponds to the same stop on the aperture wheel. So for example, if we have metered our scene at f8 and 1/125th of a second, but we would like to get some more background blur, you can open up your exposure 3 stops to f2.8 and crank your shutter speed all the way up to 1/1000th of a second, and you will get roughly the same exposure. Once you get some more experience under your belt, you'll get more comfortable judging or estimating the settings you need for the scene you're trying to shoot. But until you get there, you'll be relying on light metering. Again, if you're lucky, your camera will have a working light meter. You just put some batteries in there and you're good to go. But for the rest of us, there is 2 different options. One of them will be an external light meter. The other one is metering through an app on your phone. Now, I don't have any personal experience using a physical light meter, and honestly, having to carry around an extra device is kind of unappealing to me, so I prefer to use my phone, and I've used 2 different apps. The first one is a free one, and it's honestly my favorite. It has a very prominent spot on my phone for easy access. The second one is a one I paid a few euros for, and I only use it for very specific situations. I got it because I was shooting some film that was rated 8 ISO, and the free light meter does not have a setting for 8, and the paid one does. However, I think the interface for the free one is easier to use and more straightforward, especially if you're trying to be quick, so I prefer using that one. Okay, now that we've got the basics down, it's time to load some film into this bad boy. So we are going to open up the camera by pulling this little part at the top here. You can pull it out and then a little bit extra and the camera will pop right open. I'm going to go with some 400 ISO film this time. So we open up the package. It's usually recommended that you do this outside of direct sunlight or not under bright lights to avoid exposing a lot of the film. But for this demonstration, I've got my video lights on, so it is what it is. We pull open the canister and we get our little film roll. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is every roll of film will have this little cutout part. Usually, unless you have a strange camera, most cameras you'll want this longer part to be at the bottom. As you can see, the notch here at the bottom where we can set in the film roll. Sometimes you have to pull up this top one to get the roll to fit in. And we can push it down to lock it in. Okay, our roll is secured, and then we pull out the film. And on this side, we have the take-up spool. Now on this camera, there's a little slot in there, and we're going to push this long part of the film into that slot. Make sure you get it all the way in there, otherwise your film is not going to advance correctly. This can be a little bit finicky sometimes, but you'll get the hang of it. Okay, now that that's attached, we can pull the advance lever over here to see if it'll pull our film through. And as you see, it does. It starts rolling around the spool. Now we want to make sure that this little bar that's over here, it has these little metal or these little extensions called sprockets. You want to make sure they line up with the holes so it pulls the film through and rolls it around the spool. Now that this is attached, we can close our back and fire off the first shutter. Now we are going to want to advance this for 2 shots before we start actually shooting to make sure that our first photo is in a piece of film that has not been exposed through the loading process. All right, your film is all loaded up and you're ready to go. Okay, a few more quick little things. First of all, here on the side, you have these little rings. You can attach a strap. Over here in the shutter speed ring, you can see this little window. You can lift up the outside of this ring and change it. This will tell the light meter in the camera what ISO your film is, and it's also a good reminder for yourself if you're using an external light meter. Over here on the bottom of the camera, we see several things. This is a mount for a tripod or other accessories. This is the battery compartment. You can screw it open with a coin and put a little coin cell battery in here. Usually 1.5 volt batteries will work. Just try it out and see which one fits your camera. When you've shot every shot on the roll and the film won't advance any further, you can push down this button. That will unlock the spool and allow you to flip this over and follow this arrow to rewind the film back into the canister. Now finally, up here we have what's called a hot shoe. You can again use this to mount a flash or other accessories. This red X denotes that it is indeed a hot shoe together with a little metal part in the middle. That means you can attach a flash and it will sync to your shutter speed as long as you go above 60, which is shown by this little red X on the dial. Oh, and here on the front, self timer, you can pull this out to the bottom and then pull this little tab and it will eventually take a photo for you. Now, before we go out and shoot, there's a few more things to keep in mind. Again, this front ring on your lens will be your focus ring, so you can look through the viewfinder and turn this to make sure that whatever you want to shoot is in focus. Most lenses will have these numbers to have like an indication for how far away the focus is going to be. Every lens will have a minimal focal distance. For this one, it's going to be 30 centimeters. That means that is the minimal distance from the front of the lens you will need to be to your subject for something to be in focus. There is lenses called macro lenses, which have an exceptionally short focus distance, and you can use these for macro photography. Now, different lenses will have different focal lengths. Usually you can find that on the front of the lens here. This lens is going to be a 28mm lens, so it's fairly wide angle. This other camera I have currently has a 55mm on there, which is a focal length I like to shoot a lot. It's a little bit more natural and less crazy wide. Now, there's two different types of lenses. There is prime lenses, which have a fixed focal length like this, so the field of view will always be the same. Or you can get a zoom lens, which has a variable focal length where you can zoom in and out. I personally prefer to shoot with fixed focal lenses because I like the limitation. I think it pushes you more creatively and forces you more to move around in the scene and physically step forward or backward to get the correct framing for what you want. It forces you to learn, is what I'm trying to say. Now again, focal lengths 35mm and below are usually referred to as a wide angle lenses. This will get a lot in view. Focal lengths from 35mm to about 50-55 are the more normal focal lengths, and everything above like 70 or 80 will be referred to as a telephoto lens, which is a more zoomed in effect. I recommend trying out some different focal lengths and seeing what you enjoy. Once you've found something you like, I recommend that you stick with it for a longer time so you get your mind used to kind of seeing in that focal length, and it'll be easier to spot photos while you're walking around. One more thing to keep in mind is lens mounts. This camera, for example, the KM, will have a KM mount. So this has a little tab to release, and you can see it has like this kind of metal bayonet-like construction. This will only fit on lenses with this camera mount. However, the other lens I showed you earlier, this one has an M42 mount, so this one you can just screw off, and it has this screw thread on the back. Now, these lenses are usually fairly cheap and there's a lot of them out there, so if you are starting out, I would recommend you get a camera with an M42 mounting system, so it's very easy for you to try out and experiment with different lenses. But again, there's no hard rules. Just play around, experiment. In the end, we do this because we like it and because it's fun, not because it's necessarily the correct or the right thing to do. If you found this useful, please subscribe to my channel and then close down YouTube and go outside and take some photos, and I'll catch you in another video later on. All right, peace.